Walk into any museum with a medieval clock exhibit and you'll notice something most people brush right past. The clock face doesn't look quite right. Not broken, not damaged, just different. The numbers don't stop at 12, they go further, 13, sometimes 14. The hands move in patterns that don't match any clock you've ever owned. The museum placard next to it says something vague like timekeeping system of the period, without really explaining what that means. Most visitors nod and move on. But a growing group of researchers have spent years asking a very different question. What if these clocks aren't primitive versions of our modern system? What if they're remnants of a completely different way of understanding time? One that was deliberately erased from the historical record? This is the story of the 13-hour clock. And once you see what's been hiding in plain sight in museums across Europe and Russia, you won't walk through a clock exhibit the same way. Let's start with something concrete. The Prague horologe. Built in 1410, it's one of the oldest functioning astronomical clocks in the world. Millions of tourists photograph it every year, layered with symbols, mechanical rings, moving figures. But when you look at the face carefully, you'll notice it doesn't tell time the way you expect. It has multiple dials running simultaneously, and depending on which ring you're reading, the hours aren't divided the way you learned in school. Prague isn't alone. The Strasbourg Cathedral clock, the Wells Cathedral clock in England, the Zeitglocke in Bern, Switzerland. Each of these ancient timepieces carries the same strange characteristic when examined closely, built to track something more complex than a simple 12-hour cycle, something historians have never quite settled on a clean explanation for. Now, mainstream historians will tell you this is because medieval Europeans used a system called unequal hours or canonical hours, a method of dividing daylight and nighttime into separate segments that changed length depending on the season. Technically accurate, as far as it goes. But it has always left a gap because some of these clock faces don't just divide hours differently in duration. They show 13 distinct positions, 13 stops on the face that the hand passes through in sequence. Not 12, 13. And the question nobody in a mainstream documentary ever asks is this: where did the 13th hour go? When did it disappear? And why does nobody seem bothered that it's missing? To understand why some researchers believe this matters far beyond historical curiosity, you need to understand the broader framework they're working from. The theory of Tartaria, sometimes called the Tartarian Empire, sometimes discussed alongside what proponents call the Mud Flood, proposes that before the civilization we know today, there existed a highly advanced global culture, one that built the grand structures we attribute to various separate empires and dynasties, one that had unified systems of architecture, measurement, and timekeeping. Mainstream historians reject this entirely, but proponents point to anomalies in the historical record they argue conventional frameworks cannot explain away. Buildings with foundations buried 30 or 40 feet underground in cities that supposedly never flooded. Architectural styles appearing simultaneously across continents with no documented cultural exchange. Maps showing cities and territories that supposedly didn't exist yet. And clocks with faces that don't match the system we were taught preceded our own. The 13-hour clock sits near the center of this argument. If Tartaria was real, if there was a previous civilization operating on fundamentally different standards, then its timekeeping would have been different too. And if that civilization was erased or reset, its clocks would have been among the first things relabeled or removed from active use. What's left are the survivors, artifacts that made it through the transition, sitting in glass cases in state museums labeled as regional curiosities, explained away by academics who never quite produce a satisfying answer for why the numbers don't add up. Let's talk about what actually exists. There are documented examples of clock faces with non-standard hour markings in museum collections across Europe and Russia, photographed extensively by independent researchers and circulated within the Tartaria community. The images show clock dials marked with Roman numerals or notches that clearly extend beyond 12 positions. In Russia, several antique clock faces with 13-hour markings have been documented in regional and municipal museums. The Tartaria community, tens of thousands of members across multiple languages, has catalogued photographs of these artifacts for more than a decade. Some of the most striking examples come from collections in Siberia and the Ural region, which Tartaria maps place near the geographic heart of the empire. Here is what that explanation requires you to accept. Multiple separate cultures across vast distances all independently developed the same wrong approach to dividing the day before someone eventually arrived at the 12-hour system. And none of these cultures left behind meaningful documentation of why their system differed or how the transition away from it happened. For a change that would have touched every aspect of daily life, agriculture, prayer, commerce, navigation, the historical silence around the end of the 13-hour system is striking. Here is where the historical record gets genuinely interesting, even if you are completely skeptical of Tartaria. The standardization of timekeeping is a very recent phenomenon. Time zones weren't established until 1884, when the International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C. divided the world into the system we use today. Before that, every city kept its own local time. When it was noon in London, it was 12:04 in Reading and 11:51 in Bristol. The expansion of railways eventually forced the issue. But go back further than mechanical clocks, further than mechanical clocks, further than church bells ringing canonical hours, further than the Romans who standardized the day into two sets of 12 hours, 12 for daylight, 12 for night, based on a system partly inherited from Egypt and partly adapted for their own administrative purposes. What were people using before that? What did timekeeping look like before the Roman model became the template? The honest answer is that we don't fully know. Historical records from before a certain threshold become sparse, contradictory, or absent. The further back you go, the more the consensus history of timekeeping relies on interpretation of artifacts rather than documentation. And the artifacts don't always cooperate with the interpretation being applied to them. Researchers in the Tartaria community point to this interpretive gap as the space where a previous system of time could have existed and been lost. Mainstream historians agree in their more careful writing that pre-Roman timekeeping systems are poorly understood and likely more sophisticated than surviving fragments suggest. The disagreement is about what that lost knowledge looked like and why it disappeared so completely. So why 13 specifically? If there was a different timekeeping civilization, the number at its center has to mean something real. And it does. 13 is the number of lunar cycles in a solar year. Not 12, 13. The moon completes approximately 13.37 full cycles between one January 1st and the next. Our 12-month calendar approximates the lunar rhythm but never truly aligns with it. That mismatch is why we have leap years, why Easter shifts annually, why the Islamic and Hebrew calendars drift against the Gregorian and require periodic adjustment. Many of the most ancient cultures tracked time primarily by the moon. The Hebrew calendar, the Islamic calendar, the Celtic calendar, the indigenous calendars of the Americas, the Vedic systems of ancient India. All of these either use 13 lunar cycles as a structural unit or treat 13 as a significant organizing number within their astronomical frameworks. The hypothesis in Tartaria research is direct. The 13-hour clock wasn't a failed experiment. It was a precision instrument built to track both solar and lunar times simultaneously. A dual cycle system requiring 13 dial positions to remain accurate across both rhythms without constant manual correction. When timekeeping was forced into 12 through Roman standardization, ecclesiastical enforcement, or the push during what Tartaria researchers call the reset period of the 18th and 19th centuries, the 13-position clocks became obsolete. Most were destroyed or repurposed. The ones that survived ended up in museums sitting today under vague placards waiting for someone willing to ask the right question. Here's something worth understanding about how museums handle artifacts that don't fit comfortably within accepted historical timelines. When an artifact presents a problem for the established narrative, it doesn't disappear. It gets contextualized. The placard next to it answers the surface question, what is this object, without inviting the deeper one. Why does this object exist, and what does its existence imply? Museum curators work within established academic frameworks and answer to institutions with no incentive to challenge foundational assumptions. An artifact that raises uncomfortable questions doesn't get featured in the main hall. It gets categorized, stored in a secondary collection, and explained in the vaguest terms that satisfy casual visitors without triggering difficult conversations. The 13-hour clock faces in European and Russian collections have placards mentioning alternative timekeeping systems or regional variants of the canonical hour structure. Technically defensible, but they paper over the fact that nobody has produced a satisfying explanation of how these systems functioned in practice, who used them across what geographic range, and why they disappeared so completely that most people alive today have never heard of them. If you visit the right museums and seek out the right exhibits, you can still see them. The clock faces with the extra position, the dials that don't stop where you expect. They are not locked in restricted archives. They are on public display, simply labelled in a way that makes you walk past them without counting. The evidence isn't buried. It's on display, presented in a way designed to produce incuriosity rather than questions. The 13-hour clock is one piece of a much larger puzzle being assembled from publicly available sources. There are the buildings, grand structures across Central Asia, Eastern Europe and the Americas sharing architectural DNA, the same proportions, the same decorative systems, the same relationship between interior space and exterior facade, despite officially belonging to cultures that supposedly had no meaningful contact with each other. There are the maps, cartographic documents from the 16th and 17th centuries showing cities, rivers and borders with names that don't correspond to any known civilization. Many of these label vast territories across what is now Siberia and Central Asia as Tartaria, treating it not as a vague term for nomadic peoples, but as a coherent political entity with defined borders, named cities and functioning infrastructure. There are the photographs from world exhibitions of the late 19th century. The great fairs in Chicago, St. Louis and Philadelphia show enormous, elaborately constructed buildings that look ancient rather than freshly built. The official record says these were erected in months for temporary use. Researchers look at the scale and ornamental detail and ask whether that story is genuinely plausible. And there are the clocks. The 13-hour clock faces sitting in open collections across Europe and Russia. Not secret, simply unexplained, and the institutions housing them appear comfortable leaving them that way. The mainstream position is clear. These are curiosities, regional variations in pre-modern timekeeping. Evidence of a world before standardization, where different communities kept time differently before the modern system was gradually established. Interesting footnotes, not evidence of anything larger. The Tartaria position is equally clear. These artifacts are survivors. Physical proof that a previous culture existed, operated on different principles across a vast geographic range, and was systematically overwritten. The 13-hour clock is one of many windows into a world that official history has consistently declined to look through. What is verifiably true is this: something is in those museums. Clock faces with 13 positions. Dials that don't match the system we were taught preceded our own. Artifacts receiving vague labels and minimal curatorial attention despite raising questions that have never been completely answered. Whether those artifacts point to Tartaria, to a pre-Roman civilization operating on lunar cycles, to a timekeeping tradition erased when the Roman solar calendar became the Western standard, or simply to the poorly documented reality of pre-standardization timekeeping, they deserve more than a 3-sentence placard. Next time you find yourself in a museum with a clock collection, don't just read the label. Count the positions on the face. If the numbers go past 12, stop. Think about who built that clock, what they understood about time that we no longer do, and whether the official explanation for the missing hour actually satisfies you. It might mean nothing, or it might mean the history of time itself is one of the biggest untold stories hiding in plain sight. Subscribe and stay with us. There is a lot more in the historical record that doesn't add up.